I guess the big news, of course, is the forecast news. We think, obviously, that this is very good news for the people of the state of Minnesota. We think, obviously, again, that this is a vindication for the approach that Republicans took to the budget 2 years ago. I did catch a little bit of the flavor of the previous press conference about somehow, the status quo and blah, blah, blah. However, it's hard to argue with the facts. And the facts are that we balanced the budget. We put in place reforms and spending. The things we've done have shown a continued improvement in the economy with the resulting increase in revenue that has led to, for this current biennium, enough revenue above forecast so that we have paid down the school aid shift to it's less than $1 billion. It's about $800 million now. The deficit for the budget we're working on right now has gone even from November from a $1.1 billion down to $627 million, about a 40-some% reduction. The next biennium, the out biennium, has already got a $700 million surplus. If we could delay the start of the session by another 6 months, we'd probably have a surplus now. I don't know what the argument is on the Democrat side that says we need $3.6 billion in taxes to do anything. And what is the big reform in the governor's budget? It's a big property tax shift, $1.4 billion to pay property taxes for somebody else. That's the big reform. Whoopee. This isn't a reform. There's nothing in this budget that is reform-minded at all. It's simply paying more money to do the things we're doing right now, and we can't do that. We have to, I believe, and what we did 2 years ago and what we as Republicans believe is we need to, first of all, make sure that our spending is in line with the revenues that the economy is producing, and look at spending to reform what we're doing so that we can continue to manage those projects, those expectations, so that we can afford to provide services that people expect going into the future. You can't just continue to spend money the way we have the last 30 years. That's pretty clear. So we are very encouraged by the results. We hope. The governor's talked about revising his budget proposals in the next couple of weeks. We think that there should be at least a 40+% reduction in his revenue based on the forecast. We'll see if that happens. But I just don't understand what the logic of the DFL budget is. It just makes no sense at all. We think there's been an absolute vindication of the direction that we took, and we think we ought to continue down that path.
I would agree with Senator Hann. I think that especially for me, who I'm fairly new around the Capitol, just a couple of years, I like to think about what direction we're moving and why we're doing it. And I'm kind of a results-driven person. I look back over the last 2 years, and we had an argument 2 years ago during the shutdown about whether we should tax and that would be good for the economy, or whether we should resist taxes. And ultimately, the governor agreed with our approach. We didn't raise taxes, and the economy grew, and more people are back to work. And it isn't about who gets credit for it or who doesn't get credit for it, but let's talk about what works. And the governor wants to vary from something that's working to something that hasn't been proven to work. And we think at a time when the economic recovery is fragile, it's the wrong move. The governor has talked an awful lot. In fact, Tina Smith at the chamber dinner quoted me and said that the governor agreed with me that we should have a litmus test for every bill that passes. Is this going to make Minnesota more competitive? Is this going to help Minnesota job creators create jobs in Minnesota? That's great. But you can't say that and then introduce a tax policy which does exactly the opposite. So we are committed to working with the governor and with the DFL majorities to do what's best for Minnesota. But I think we need to really have an honest conversation about what has worked and what hasn't worked, and whether changing course right now is the best move for Minnesota. And I think obviously based on the results of the forecast yesterday, we can see that our policies have worked. So we obviously will make that argument over the coming months, but it's very apparent now to see that this isn't about revenue for the state. And the reason I say that is we actually created more revenue in the current biennium than the governor does with all of these tax increases in the next biennium. I think it's difficult for them to understand that you actually can raise revenue without raising taxes. And if you do that, if you grow the economy and create jobs, everybody wins. And the problem with the governor's plan is he wants to create winners and losers. And you know what? We don't need to do that. We've got policies in place right now that seem to be allowing Minnesota's economy to grow. It's allowing Minnesota's job creators to do exactly what they're good at, which is create jobs. I can remember 5 to 10 years ago when businesses were competing for employees. Now when you go and apply for a job, there's 200 other people that apply. And yes, the unemployment rate is 1.5 points less than it was 2 years ago, which is phenomenal. But people have taken lower paying jobs. The way to get those wages up isn't to introduce minimum wage bills. It's to create demand in the marketplace for employees like we had 5 and 10 years ago. It's to grow the economy so that employers are competing for employees. We need a competitive job market. We've talked a lot about educating our workforce. I agree with the DFL that is important, but we have one of the best workforces in the country here in Minnesota. And every time I travel anywhere, everybody says that about the Midwestern work ethic. The problem is, if we educate those people here in Minnesota and we don't have a competitive job for them in Minnesota when they're done with their education, they're not going to stay here. So we need to grow Minnesota's economy. And we know by doing that, that's what's going to be good and work for all Minnesotans. And that's what we're for. It seems the DFL just has an appetite for spending, and we can see now through this forecast and the fact that they haven't reeled back any of their tax proposals. I would think that the first thing that they would do was say, okay, well, we don't need this tax now. Nope, we're going to double down, and we still need $3.7 billion worth of taxes to solve a $600 million problem. So obviously, their intent is we've got to tax more. And frankly, I think we can see that that's the wrong move for Minnesota. So,
yeah, to that point, I think, to me, what this, I think, clearly shows that the DFL has got a commitment to a left-wing progressive ideology that trumps any practical, any common sense considerations. They just believe that you need to have more taxes so you can grow the size of government, so that you can make government do more things, because they fundamentally do not trust that ordinary people are smart enough to make decisions that can better their own lives. That you can't trust the economy, you can't trust businesses, you can't trust the marketplace. You got to bring all that money in, give it to legislators, give them the opportunity to spend a bunch of money. That is the key to any good thing. And it's just not true. But they have such a strong ideological commitment to that idea that they're willing to do that in the face of any reasonable common sense notions, any facts to the contrary. And I think clearly the results that we're seeing in the forecast show that there's no need at all to do anything like what this budget calls for. But they're persisting in doing it, and they're still defending it. It just doesn't even make any sense. So you might have other questions about other things, but that was the big news, I think. For this.
Senator Hann,
yes.
As the forecast suggested, the governor probably could do with about 42 or 43% less revenue.
Could do with zero, but as far as I'm concerned. But go ahead.
But if you were to reduce it 40% or so, what are the most onerous tax increases that he's proposed? Which ones would you like him to cut back first?
Well, I'd like to have him cut all the new rates back. That's what I would like to see him do. I think all of us on the Republican side would say, Governor, you don't need to raise tax rates to see a growth in revenue, as Representative Daudt just said. You can grow revenue without growing tax rates. We've proven that. You can do that.
But he wants to reduce the rates on sales tax and corporate income tax.
He says that, but when you look at the amount of revenue coming in from the sales tax piece of it, it's $2 billion plus. So he's growing revenue from sales taxes by expanding the application of that tax. So I guess if you want to make an argument for reform and say let's apply sales taxes to more things and lower the rate and keep it, quote, revenue neutral, if he wants to propose that, that might be something that would be worth perhaps talking about. But I don't think that's what they want to do. What they clearly want to do is find ways to raise or implement new tax revenue raising streams. That's what they want. They want more revenue raising streams so they can spend more money. That's what I think they want.
But is one of the tax increases more onerous than the others that he's proposed?
I think clearly in the news feedback I've gotten, the business-to-business tax is, I haven't heard anybody say anything positive about that. I haven't even heard any Democrat leaders say anything positive about it, I guess, but I have not heard anything positive about that. But I think generally the sales taxes are looked at, certainly in the application of them, to things that people typically are not used to paying taxes on. I just heard this morning they're talking about taxing dog walking. and snow shoveling and lawn mowing. And so here we are talking about raising minimum wages. That's mostly going to be on teenagers, and then we're going to tax all the things that they do anyway. So why don't we just call it even and not do it at all? So it's just bizarre.
Let me ask the reverse of Bill's question. A lot of the money the governor wants to spend is on education and property tax relief through rebates and other forms. Are you against spending money on those two things?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the rebate thing. The state doesn't raise any local property taxes. So for us to do this doesn't really make any sense. These are property taxes that are raised by local people who elect local governments who they, in fact, in many cases, voted for these tax raises themselves. So it doesn't reform the taxes locally, it doesn't change them, it doesn't lower them, it just says somebody else is going to pay them. That is a horrible idea, in my opinion. If you want to have property tax reform, well, again, that's a debate that many of us in the legislature, Republicans, are willing to have that. But this isn't that idea. I think the other part of your question was on education. I think the budget that we passed 2 years ago, we had funds that went to the general formula. I think the governor actually has a fewer amount of dollars slated to go to the general formula than the budget we passed. I think many of us believe that we would like to see more money being dedicated to help education. However, there needs to be linkage between that money and the actual accomplishments. What do we do with it? That's lacking, in our opinion, from what the governor's budget is proposing. He's proposing spending more money, but it's very short on what the results of that spending will be. We think there should be some stronger linkage between spending money and the results you're going to get.
Daudt, how many amendments do you have planned for the...
Could you
We can come back to that one. I want to talk about the exchange rates.
Could you answer the tax question before we move on to another subject?
Sure.
Which taxes do you consider most onerous of the ones the governor's proposed?
You know, I would agree that the business to business is one that we've heard a lot about. The sales tax thing, I think there are concerns about, and I'm going to tell you why I think they're concerning. Because they fall squarely on the backs of middle-class Minnesotans. And I know the governor was very honest during his campaign and the subsequent campaign cycle that he was going to raise taxes on the top 2%, so we weren't surprised about that. But saying that you're only going to raise taxes on the wealthy and then putting all these taxes on middle-class Minnesotans when they may be struggling in this recovering economy already isn't the right move. And the business to business, I think everybody knows that businesses, when they get hit with fees and taxes, they have to pass that along to their customers. So you end up with higher prices of goods and services because of that. So and who buys that? Everyday Minnesotans do. So they're the ones who are going to be impacted by that. The sales tax, if we want to talk about reform, we certainly can. I'm happy to have that conversation. But I'm not fooled. This isn't about reform. It's about picking up the revenue. The governor's picking up, by changing the sales taxes around and taxing services and the like, he's picking up, I think it's $2.1 billion in revenue to the state. Projected, of course. I would argue that he's probably not going to pick that up because people are going to stop buying those things, or you'll see a change in behavior. And we know that happens. I mean, Speaker Thiessen had a conversation on the radio here a month ago where he said one of the benefits of the cigarette tax is that you'll reduce the use of it. So we know that taxes change people's behavior. Everybody knows that. And if you're really committed to making Minnesota more competitive for job creators, we need to stop putting burdens on the people who create jobs in Minnesota. The government doesn't create jobs, the private sector does. So we need to really show that we've got a commitment to stay ahead of the competitors around us, the surrounding states and the people in our region. Because businesses are going to start leaving. It's a very mobile economy today. People can move very easily. I mean, we all have friends on Facebook and other countries even, and it's very easy to relocate and continue your business in just the way you had before. So with the internet and those kinds of things. So I think we need to stay committed to what we all say, and the governor has said it many times. And I might be Senator Hann and I might be the only ones, but I'm not going to let the governor get away with saying that he wants Minnesota to be more competitive for job creators, and then putting these kinds of burdens on the people who create jobs in Minnesota. This budget forecast is a great example. Where did the growth come from? income tax, okay? 7% unemployment 2 years ago, 5.5% today. 60,000 more people working just last year, okay? That's where the state picked up the revenue. That's good for every Minnesotan. Every Minnesotan does better when we move in that direction. So these taxes will make it more difficult and will make Minnesota businesses less competitive, and that's wrong. You know, I know they want to talk about shifts and gimmicks, and now the new one is status quo. If the status quo means that Minnesota's economy is growing and Minnesota's economy is creating jobs and middle-class Minnesotans are doing better in this economy, then I want the status quo, because that means that we're improving. These guys want tax increases, and they're going to do everything they can to make an excuse for it. But unfortunately, the evidence doesn't exist.
I think Representative Seifert used to say, you can't be pro-egg and anti-chicken. And that's kind of the thing that's going on here. He says, we all want more business growth, but then we're going to do everything we can to kill the economy that produces good business results. So.
You asked about the exchange. We've got the exchange on the floor on Monday. Well, you know,
will be any Republican votes?
my record is 158, so I don't know. No, I'm teasing. I have given the commitment to the Speaker that our caucus is committed to working on this bill, that we want to work on it in a bipartisan fashion, and that we're. Yeah, this isn't something to play political games with. So I don't know how many amendments we're going to have. My members obviously have until noon today. We're getting close to the deadline to submit amendments under the 24-hour rule. But I don't know how many there are going to be. I don't think we'll have a lot of amendments, and I think they'll be substantive. I will say, and it's my understanding that the Speaker mentioned that, or the Majority Leader mentioned that this bill is very bipartisan. Again, we can't say one thing and do another. We don't get to call this bill bipartisan and say that we've taken all kinds of Republican amendments when they haven't taken one substantive Republican amendment yet. There are tons of problems with this bill. This bill is not going to be good for Minnesota. We're obviously going to have a spirited debate about it on the floor. But when we go to the floor on Monday, we're going to talk about the facts. We're going to talk about what's good for Minnesota, what's good for Minnesota's economy, and what's good for job creators in Minnesota. And the rest of it, we don't care about. So we can't call something bipartisan just because we want everybody to write that in their newspaper. We actually have to show that with our actions. And this bill to this point is not bipartisan.
And I would say,
What are the biggest problems?
Other question about if you expect any Republican support.
We may have one vote for it. I want to be very cautious here to say whether we're going to have votes for it or not have votes for it, because I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. We've got an opportunity on the floor to have a great debate. We've got an opportunity on the floor to adopt amendments and to fix this bill and to make it bipartisan. So I'm not going to say that they will or won't. As far as I'll probably go is say if the bill doesn't change from where it is right now, they're likely to have not more than one vote. And I think that vote probably is just going to be somebody wanting to get on the conference committee.
Doesn't it have two Republican co-authors?
Yeah, but both of those people are on record right now saying that they wouldn't vote for the bill in its current form. So.
What are the biggest problems here?
Well, you know, I think there's a lot of things from the makeup of the board itself, the non-compete stuff. You've got, or the conflict of interest language, which sounds great, but the problem is you don't put people on the board who actually know about the insurance industry. So, I mean, we need people involved in the process who actually understand how the process works, and having people from the insurance business on the board helps. Not saying the board needs to be run by them, but at least have some input. So, you know, bureaucrats aren't going to make this thing run well. Bureaucrats don't have a good track record. So, you know, among other things, there's a lot of other things too.
yeah, I think in the Senate, same kind of experience. In fact, we met with the governor earlier this week, and we've told him candidly, straightforwardly, that this bill does not have support in the legislature from Republicans. If the idea is to have a bipartisan bill, this isn't it. Now, maybe things can happen in a conference committee, but since neither the House or the Senate bill is being supported by Republicans, with perhaps an exception for reason to maybe try to make the bill better. But there's been a lot of amendments that we've offered in the Senate. None of them have been accepted. No substantial amendments have been accepted that have been Republican-offered amendments. This is not a good bill. We have, to my knowledge, none of our members who are willing to vote for the bill at this point. We have talked to members of the various business groups, Chamber of Commerce and others, who say bill in its current form is not supported by those groups. So the people who are going to be affected, consumers, insurance agents, the business community, small businesses, nobody supports this bill. The people who support this bill are the DFL legislators and the unions. That's who supports the bill. And I think that's a poor argument to say this is the bill that we ought to put before Minnesota. There are many people who believe that this is a vehicle just to facilitate a single-payer system in Minnesota. That's what it looks like. We've tried to offer amendments to try to make this a more market-driven idea. We understand. We lost the election. We didn't get to have the way that we wanted to do it, but nevertheless, we came into the session thinking, all right, let's see if we can make this work. And a lot of people outside of the legislature had the same idea, and we had amendments to try to move in that direction. All of them were turned away. So at this point, we feel like, well, okay, they have the votes, they have the majority, they can do what they want, and they're going to do it. But to then say that this is bipartisan, that's just flat out not true. And so we'll see what happens.
Didn't you have your chance in the last Didn't you have your chance last year to develop a health exchange?
Well, first of all, I don't believe in a health exchange as a necessary thing.
So isn't that a problem? That the federal government said you must have a health exchange?
Well, they said that they've said that you have to have one, or that they will do one for you. Now, Wisconsin has said, fine, do it, and we'll see what happens there. I'm not sure that will happen.
For the federal, since
I would
you
prefer.
didn't act last year.
Well, I don't think that they're actually going to do one in Wisconsin. Look at what happened in Utah, for example. They built something 5 or 6 years ago that completely doesn't comply with the federal law. And the federal government is saying, fine, we'll let you do that. So the point is, I think, that the federal government is completely unprepared to implement this law. And so when they say, you have to do it or we'll do it, what they really mean is, if you don't do it, then it probably won't get done. And so from my perspective, that's not a bad trade-off. So I would prefer that we didn't do it. But we lost that debate. We lost the argument. We lost the election. The majority has the votes. They can do what they wish to do.
In terms of complaining about what the Democrats are now doing, weren't you in a position of power just a year ago to create something that you could have lived with?
Well, we didn't want to create an exchange because we didn't believe it was necessary. And we still don't believe, many of us, not all of us, but many of us believe it's not necessary to do it. However, we, as practical people, realizing that we lost the election, we came into the session saying, all right, we lost the election. Let's try to work with this and make it as good as we can make it. Let's make it as market-oriented as we can. Let's try to solve these practical problems. And I met with the governor, and I met with Commissioner Jessen and others, and I pledged we will do everything we can to work with you to try to make this as good as we can make it. And there was a very good faith effort, and you look at the amendments that were offered in committee, these weren't political stunts. These were things that were substantive and were trying to get at good policy, and they were all turned away. And so it's hard to look at that experience and say, well, this is not being driven by policy considerations in the sense of trying to work with our concerns. It's being driven by policy considerations. It says we have in mind an exchange that's going to facilitate something that I guess is their own vision of this thing that I don't think is broadly supported by the public.
In terms of election reforms, the Senate passed their omnibus election bill out of the Rules Subcommittee on a party line vote. That's another area where the governor wants bipartisan support. Do either of you see any support for early voting or no excuse absentee from Republican caucuses?
We've heard the no excuse absentee ballot, I think, on the House side. I don't think we've heard the early voting stuff yet. We actually had breakfast with the governor this week, and he reiterated his prior statement that he believes that election bills need to have broad bipartisan support, and we appreciate that. But it gives us a little bit of power too, in almost like a veto. So if we don't put any Republican votes up, he's pledged to veto that stuff. So. As far as the early voting having Republican support, I think we haven't heard it on the House side yet. The Senate, I think, had it in their omnibus bill. I think I'll look forward to that debate in the House. But I think we want to make sure that it's the right move and it makes sense. I know some other states are doing it. Quite a few aren't. we need to make sure that we're really addressing a problem. Again, it's kind of like looking at the budget. We have the highest voter turnout in the country. Is there really a problem? And what are we trying to solve? So I think everybody just wants to make sure we're doing what's best and makes our election system has the most people voting while still, obviously we still want to maintain integrity in the system. So as long as, we can hash out those details, I think, we'll be happy to talk about any of that stuff.
So that means you're open to early voting. That's not a no-go.
Under certain circumstances, absolutely. I mean, we certainly could be, but we want to make sure that there's integrity in the system too. So I'm not saying we wouldn't do it, but I'd want to make sure that there was, increased integrity in the system as well. We don't want to reduce the integrity of our election system. I think increasing voter participation is always a great goal, but at the same time, we need to maintain or increase integrity in the system as well. So if we can do that, I'm fine.
Well, Senator Hann, would you defer to Senator Newman or Senator Kiffmeyer or Senator Limmer in terms of the Senate caucus's view on early voting? All of them voted against.
Well, and Senator Newman is the lead in our committee, and all three of them, of course, have worked on this issue over the past years. And we've talked about this a couple times in our caucus, and the views that Representative Daudt are expressing are very similar to the ones in our caucus. We are not against necessarily any of these things that they're talking about, expanding availability of voting opportunities. The one thing that they've had difficulty getting the attention of the Democrats is anything to do with improving the integrity of the system. And when we had the ballot initiative to bring photo ID, the governor very famously and publicly said, send it back to the legislature, fix it up, implying that it needed to be improved, that the idea of voter integrity wasn't a bad idea. He just didn't think that what was on the ballot was the right idea. So we I think, genuinely took him at his word, said, all right, well, there should be something to what can we do to work on that? There's been nothing offered on the DFL side to address that. We think that there should be some things to address those integrity issues and these initiatives that come forward. One of the reasons why that's not, the omnibus bills, at least on our side, are not getting the support is because those ideas are not getting any opportunity to be addressed in these bills. And so our members are saying, well, if you're not interested in that, then why would we go ahead and just pass these bills out if you're not going to pay attention to any things that we think are important as well? And they should be bipartisan. Election bills should be bipartisan. Otherwise, it's just electioneering. It's just one side taking advantage of the fact they have the majority.
So wait, are you saying that your members won't support any election overhaul efforts if it doesn't include what you think is election integrity?
I think that that is one of the things that the members in our caucus have talked about as being very important. They are not supporting any of the bills so far. That may not be the only reason, but it's one of the reasons.
But that sounds like a pretty firm line in the sand.
Well, I think it's an important principle, and we, in fact, talked about that with the governor in our breakfast meeting as well.
Is there Republican support for the governor's $30 million Minnesota Investment Fund proposal, which we heard about here in this room earlier today?
I think on the Senate side, I believe one of our members, I think Senator Gazelka, perhaps, is a co-author. So I personally don't know a lot of detail about it, but my understanding is it's an initiative to try to help improve the business climate. So I don't know a lot about it, but obviously there's bipartisan support of one of our members, and I don't know if you know anything about it either. Okay.
How about in the House?
I don't know. I don't know if the bill's been introduced. Has it been introduced in the House? On the House side, I don't know. I'd have to follow up and find out.
Generally, do you support the use of incentives in trying to help business?
It depends on the incentive. It always depends on how these things are structured, and I think that's where the devil's always in the details. As I said, I'm not familiar with the bill, but Senator Gazelka is one of our members, and he supports it, so it's got some bipartisan interest, so there must be something good in it, so I don't know the details of it.
Representative Daudt, what are the prospects for moving the primary up to June?
We actually passed the June primary bill out of the House Elections Committee yesterday on a voice vote, and sounds like it was a unanimous vote out of the committee. I don't know at this point what the prospects are. I do understand that the June primary actually went on to the Senate omnibus elections bill. So I think it's and I think it's been introduced as a standalone bill in both bodies. So I think it's moving in both bodies. I'm obviously there's broad bipartisan support for it, and ultimately it's up to the DFL if they want to move it. But I know the governor supports it, and he mentioned that to us again on when we had breakfast this week. So I think it can happen, and it's not a partisan thing. It's just I think a good government thing, and I'm hopeful that it will, but we'll see.